All right.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Safe Space for White Questions, or welcome to Safe Space for White Questions if this is your first time with us. Welcome to the March edition 2023. I am Alex Khasnabish, and I'm coming to you from the unceded, unsurrendered territories of the Mi'kmaq Nation in current-day Halifax, Nova Scotia. I'm going to pass it over to my partner in crime, Ajay Parasram, in just a second for him to introduce himself. Some of you probably know us pretty well. Other folks maybe just getting to know us. So I'm going to do a quick introduction. My name is Alex Khasnabish. I sell my labor for a wage at Mount Saint Vincent University, where I work as a professor in sociology and anthropology. And I am one half of the duo that is Safe Space for White Questions. We are here to answer your asked questions about all things anti-racism, about race and racism, and about social justice. And we are, of course, taking your questions live, as well as those that have been sent to us via our anonymous Google Sheet before the day of. So we're going to get to those questions in just a second. But before I do that, let me pass it over to AJ for him to say hello.
Hey folks, I'm Ajay Parasram. Really happy to be here with you all. Like Alex said, we've been at this for a little while now. We're really excited about the amount of questions. I mean, like we're at a record high for the amount of questions submitted. So don't be shy. Those of you who are watching live, please do submit your live questions. And we're going to try as we can to privilege the live questions, and then we'll figure out what to do with some of the backlog questions if we don't get to everything. But yeah. I teach also at Dalhousie University, where the Wi-Fi is sketchy today. But I was able to, anyway, the details don't matter. I figured it out. So back to you, Alex. Let's get started.
Yeah, maybe we'll just say very quickly that we'll apologize for being a few minutes late if you were waiting for us. It is the gremlins on the interwebs that were interfering with us. So, but we're here now. So that's what matters. Anyway, like AJ said, tons of questions. We're going to jump right into it. And if you are with us for the first time, just letting you know, perhaps you're a return visitor, then reminding you that what we do is we spend our time going back and forth on these questions. We take them as they come in. This month, it's my month to lead off. So I'll read the question, take a shot at answering, and then pass it to AJ for his thoughts. And that's how we'll do it. So without any further ado, first question. Is it cancel culture or so-called wokism or all of the above and more that have created a need for a safe space for white questions? Where's the line between educating and accepting people's ignorance and not letting them be part of public discourse, considering, of course, their own openness to grow in their own understanding? So great question, for sure. My 2 cents about this, is it cancel culture or wokeism that's created the need for this? I don't think so. I think, like we've talked about before on this series, part of our conviction in doing this is that, like the struggle against racism, struggle against forms of racialized supremacy, like that's a very long road, and we are just travelers on that road, like with many other people. And a lot of what we do here is just like amplifying their voices to you or finding ways to transmit some of that incredible knowledge and struggle. So I don't think like our project is just sort of built on the backs of that stuff that's come before. So it's not really a specific response to the culture wars of the current moment. But I guess I would say that, yes, like we're stepping in, from my perspective anyway, Safe Space for White Questions is in part a response to that, because sometimes discussions, especially in like more social justice aligned or radical or even movement spaces, can be a little bit unwelcoming to the uninitiated and to newcomers who often feel, rightly or wrongly, afraid, anxious, nervous, right? Like we all feel that way. You go to a new coffee shop, you sit down, you don't know the people there. Maybe you're a bit anxious, let alone walking into a room to ask people about issues around race and racism. So, I mean, really not a direct response, but yeah, I would say like the amplification, the superheating of the temperatures around conversations relating to especially race and social justice in our current moment convinced us, I think that this kind of initiative was worthy, and certainly not the only way to proceed, not the only line to take on this kind of intervention, but a way to open things up and welcome people in who aren't already super educated on these issues. To your second point, is there a line? I mean, I think questions around the line is tough. Is there a line where you can prevent people from participating in public discussion? I mean, if you're asking me straight up about how I feel about cancel culture, I think, yeah, they're obviously, like, we don't need to, not every space needs to be constantly open to everybody's uninformed and crappy opinion. Like, I was reading this really great thing about social media last week where, one of the commentators was just saying, like, not everybody is owed a platform all the time for everything they think. I mean, think about all the things that go through your head, right? I made a crummy curry last week. Should I go out on the street and for the next 10 days shout the recipe out to everybody else, either in as a suggestion to try it or as a warning against it? No, probably not, right? So not every speech act is worthy of being amplified. Like, what kinds of conversations do we need to have, right? That said, that's not the same thing as defending a censorship line, right? So, like, not allowing people to have platforms for their uninformed or awful opinions is not the same thing as censorship. And this is a big discussion, but I'm going to leave it there, pass it to AJ for his thoughts.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I guess I have a slightly different take on it, in that it's, just a simpler take. So the first part of the question, I actually just think, so, the question is cancel culture or wokism helping to create the need for a space like this? I don't really think it is. I think pragmatism is, building on what Alex was saying. It's just a pragmatic thing to have a space where people feel that they can ask these kinds of questions. And on that other piece, my hope, I guess, is that it doesn't, in creating space like this, far from platforming, baseline racial ignorance to call it what it is, we're hoping that it corrals and moves questions of that nature into spaces like this to then improve the public discourse. So our project, as I understand it, is actually built around kind of trying to be in the background of raising the baseline level of education around the politics and understanding of race and racial justice in particular, social justice more generally, such that when we have public questions, somebody doesn't take up space in a big town hall meeting saying, what's the deal with race or so, or so we can move on with that anyway. Oh yeah, back to you, Alex.
Just before I read the next question, I just wanted to say I think AJ gave a wonderful answer to the second part of that question, which I probably misunderstood when I read it. Just wanted to say that I think that idea of elevating is awesome, and yeah, much more on point than what I said. Anyway, moving on. When does a person become Indigenous? There's evidence that most people originated from East Central Africa and spread from there, eventually, whether across an ice bridge or across water expanse by boat. Scale is hard to ignore, like thousands of years versus a group like Icelandic Vikings or Acadians at maybe 1,000 years to a few hundred. So when does a person become Indigenous? Thank you for your question. This is, again, this is a tricky one. Well, I think tricky for some people. It depends how you're thinking about the concept of indigeneity. For me, and I'm going to position this in our context, like indigeneity, like anything else, like whiteness and blackness as racial categories, they don't exist as eternal identities, right? Like Indigenous people didn't think of themselves as Indigenous before settlers were here. So indigeneity is an identity category that is always relational to like a project of settler colonialism. There are no Indigenous people if you don't have settlers, right? Humans have always moved. We have always traveled, as you're pointing out in your question. The very fact that we're here almost indisputably, well, I won't say indisputably, we continue to collect evidence, But as an anthropologist, I can confidently say that both the genetic evidence and all the archaeology strongly points to, like a single origin hypothesis for humanity in Africa. And that's a beautiful, wonderful thing. But 75,000 years ago, all our human ancestors made their way all over the world, right? Mainly by walking eventually, and made their way to different parts of the world and put down roots. And, other earlier iterations of our human ancestors tried similar things, right? Neanderthals, Homo erectus before, different kinds of attempts to migrate outside of the African continent. So we are a part of that legacy, when we think about indigeneity, I think that the appropriate place to consider it is in relation to the project of settler colonialism that has really defined a large part, and certainly the dominant part, of the geopolitical order today, and has shaped indelibly the last 500 years. So really, we're talking about that. I take your question, I take your point. It's a great one. I guess, sort of hypothetically speaking, we use the term indigenous to refer to populations who have who precede the habitation of a given territory by other peoples. But to imagine that these people were either always here or somehow have rights to trump other people's presences on that territory by virtue of being there first, I think treads for me too close to blood and soil arguments about the connection between people and the land. Most Indigenous people, when you talk to them about this, when you read their writing, when you look at their films around this, clearly talk about the importance of relationships to territory, to ancestors, to non-human life that inhabits that territory. That's all relationships, right? It's not about we've been here for 15,000 years, although obviously that gets brought up in the context when you're making legal arguments around territory, around resources, around political autonomy, and those are all things that Indigenous people are struggling for these days. Obviously, that has to be made in a language that the courts understand, for example, and often that comes back to playing games that are set up by systems that are foreign, right? So habitation, duration, precedence on the land, that's all important. But I think in a bigger perspective, indigeneity is about confronting the crimes of settler colonialism. And once we do away with settler colonialism, we won't need to think so in black and white terms about these categories, because part of the process of unsettling ourselves as settlers is finding a new relationship, not running away, not being sent back to Europe. I've never met an Indigenous person who said we should do that, but rather refiguring our relations to the people and the territories that we inhabit, and the folks and their political projects and cosmologies who are here before us. Over to you, AJ.
Yeah, thanks for that, Alex. In starting that answer to this question, I'm reminded of this beautiful section of a book called The Black Pacific by Robbie Shilliam. I think it's already on our reading list. If not, I'll remember to put it on there. And he is talking about conversations he was having with Maori people about the word pakea, which I hope I'm saying right, which is the Maori word that they use to describe settlers, white settlers in particular, and talked about how the definition of what a settler was changed over time. And this person was explaining, when we say the word pakea, what we mean right now is the kind of person who, when it's raining, will put up an umbrella and not make space for you under the umbrella, which is definitely not a definitive, blood legalistic way of understanding what a settler is, right? Or what a white person is. And I feel like there's the relationality bit is important in terms of the essence, in terms of how language, for example, here in Mi'kma'ki, I read this beautiful article by the author whose name was Misit Nokomak, which means all my relations. It's actually a blanket term that the 10 or 12 authors who wrote the article, including, folks like Elder Albert Marshall and our colleagues, Sherry Pictou and others, they chose the fact that they chose to give first author status to this science article with the word, in which in Mi'kmaq means all our relations, I think speaks volumes to even like the disposition of how the research is presented, how the research was conducted, the collaborative conversational tone in which it took. So, indigeneity is going to mean different things in different land. And I think the development alongside the land in the long term, and what is very clearly, I think, the long term, right? So in one sense, the first thing I would say about this question that is a little problematic is the presentation of at what moment does one become Indigenous, right? We can ask at what moment does one become a citizen, because a citizen is like a very circumscribed legalistic category that the modern state has established in relatively recent terms. So we know that if you are in Canada for 3 out of 5 years and blah, 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 then you might meet the qualifications to become a citizen. That is not the same for a concept like Indigenous. So, 20,000 years of linguistic and cultural development here in Mi'kmaq has allowed, as Shalan Chowdhury explains in this piece on by Misit Nyokamak, that has enabled the Mi'kmaq language to develop alongside the actual land, so that there are insights ontologically that are grounded in Indigenous culture that is simply not accessible to a settler language or a settler conception like French or English or Hindi or whatever, what have you, because it hasn't developed alongside this. It kind of reminds me too, and this is a documentary I saw where people were musing about these ancient Brahminical chants in Kerala, where they tried to trace it, the paleolinguistics, and the closest thing they could find wasn't even human, but it was bird song that was popular in that region of South India. So it kind of speaks to like really deep relational connections, but also a history that is somewhat irrefutable. Like there's a difference between if you say, I've been here for 150 years, am I Indigenous now? Or you've been here for 20,000 years. At some level, that scale is really, really significant. What else did I want to say about this? So, it's kind of about, it's about ontology and history. I think when we talk about indigeneity today, we can't separate it from the historical context of modernity. And when I say modernity, I mean from 1492 onwards. I'm not talking about the Enlightenment only. So there were really important political and world transforming things that started in 1492. Colonization, genocide, the rise of capitalism, the industrialization and globalization of slavery and transnational slavery. And all of these things became world-making events. And part of that was the silencing and violent attempt to dismantle all other ways of understanding the world and human conceptions of what that world is. In my work, I call that the violence of universality. And I don't want to, we try really hard not to get all academic in these talks. So I'll reserve my statements to some extent, but that violence of universal reason is connected to the genealogy of science, to the history of scientific discourse. So we don't want to be too scientific in this, right? Science by design is necessarily very assertive. It's very there's no room for error. And consequently, it's wrong often, right? Like it was science that told us at one point that there were races, that we could measure people's noses and craniums, and that gave us some kind of useful information. And we know that's garbage. This is one of the things we like about science, right? It's falsifiable and we throw it out as soon as we disprove it. But there's something really alienating and inhumane about that when we're talking about people's history and their ancestors and whatnot. So I would caution, don't try and look for a specific boundary, a specific amount of time upon which one becomes Indigenous, because the process of indigeneity is related, as Alex explained, to settlers in particular, which then frames it as something quite particular to 1492 to now. If we were to talk about what indigeneity meant 700 years ago, it would be a very different conversation than even perhaps 700 years from now. So yeah, back to you, Alex.
Yeah, great points for sure. All right, moving along here. Another question about Indigenous peoples and their struggles. What do Indigenous people really want? The Indian Act is often a target of scorn and frustration, understandably. There was the White Paper, the Meech Lake Accord, and on, to flex my historical knowledge, like I'm actually something special, LOL. First Nations, Metis, and Inuit responses have been powerful, like Idle No More, Oka Resistance, Harper Stand, AIM in the United States, etc., yet seem episodic and almost like fads. I've thought that the heart of the issue is a lack of unity of thought and specific goals, as ignorant and one-sided as that view is. So what do Indigenous people want? We hear this question often when there is an upsurge in social movement activity around a marginalized and oppressed group doing something, right? What do Black people want? What do women want? What do queer people want? What do the poor want? And like, that's an understandable response, I think, if you're looking at those struggles from the outside in a great distance, because, they often seem to explode out of nowhere. But I think as a starting point, we have to acknowledge that these terms that we use for these groups are homogenizing, and to pick up on what AJ was just saying, like somewhat universalizing. They're kind of convenient shorthand, obviously, when we're having quick conversations, but we should never assume that they actually kind of like speak for a real reality. So like this story that AJ was just telling, all these different Indigenous peoples are also incredibly distinct, diverse, and unique in their own cultural, social, historical specificity, identity, in terms of their orientations to the world, in terms of their languages, in terms of their cosmologies. It's all different, right? It's like talking about Europe as if it's like one place. It's like it's a part of a continent, but it's incredibly like diverse, right? In terms of the societies that inhabit that space. So could I talk about what Europeans want? Would I ask that question? Would it make sense? Probably not, right? So I guess I would say, while it's worth kind of thinking about indigeneity and set up against the settler colonial context and the struggle. So I think you can broadly say Indigenous struggles in a world shaped by settler colonialism are about political autonomy, are about cultural resurgence, are about social and physical resurgence and building power, and recovering and rebuilding societies that have been decimated by the violence of the colonial project, right? Like, broadly speaking. But I mean, you can meet people, who want a whole variety of things. So what does any individual Indigenous person wants? I don't know. Like right now, find an Indigenous person who wants to take a nap, who wants to watch a hockey game, who wants to go hunting, So let's just keep that diversity constantly in mind, that, even the public faces of these movements don't speak homogeneously or holistically for diverse peoples. And what Indigenous people in this part of North America, this part of Turtle Island today want, may be entirely different from what Indigenous people, let's say in Mexico, are struggling for right now. Again, different contexts, different histories, different genealogies of struggle. That said, to sort of put a clearer cap on this, maybe in terms of your question, I think I could because you're tickling my social movement studies funny bone on this one, so I'm going to restrict my answer to this, because I'm sure AJ has lots to say on this one. We got lots of questions, so I don't want to talk for too long. I guess I would say this is the thing that I always get asked as a dude who studies social movements, right? People say this all the time. Oh, why, why? We see this great upsurge and then it just fades away. Why can't there be more? And I would say, don't let the powers that be and modern media convince you that the most visible face of these movements is all that's going on, right? So the explosions of activity that we see popping up above ground, if you think about, what's going on right now, any kind of climate protest, for example, that's not all the climate justice movement is doing, right? And that climate justice movement is connected to other struggles, other organizations outside of its own geographical location and time. All movements are like this, right? So Idle No More maybe seem oh, that was a good 5 years. But if you consider the links between the story that you yourself are telling me, you're telling us in your question, Meech Lake, Oka, Idle No More, Burnt Church. Like honestly, we could construct a really and just by picking out the signposts along the way, what you're actually constructing is a genealogy of resistance, dissent, and alternative building. And that's what many Indigenous people are struggling for. I'm not an Indigenous person. I'm not going to speak for them. There's lots of great writing out there that we have pointed to already. Leanne Bedasamsake Simpson has written about this. Glenn Coulthard, Tayaki Alfred, so many amazing authors. Sherry Pictou, lots of folks. We've check out our reading list. We pointed you towards, those struggles, those people in those communities are the ones who legitimately should speak for themselves and drive their own political agenda. But from my understanding, I would say, broadly speaking, what Indigenous people want is the same thing that you probably want and you already probably enjoy, at least in some small fashion, which is control over your life, the hope for a better life for your children and the ones who come after them, a non-polluted, non-toxified environment, real political autonomy, a vibrant and self-determined cultural context that is not fed to you by your colonial overlords and masters, a real reconciliation with an incredibly violent past that leads to a material return of territory and resources. And that doesn't mean that Canada has to disappear or that Canadians have to be sent away. That's a relational project, but I'm going to leave it there. Just don't ever mistake the smoke for the fire, right? Don't mistake the tip of that iceberg for its giant mass underneath. There's lots going on, even when we're not seeing it, especially if you're not involved in that long work of organizing for change on the ground. Over to you, AJ.
Yeah, I guess the only thing I would add to that is, aside from first starting by the fact that I also am not Indigenous, and it's not because I don't come from a place where there are Indigenous people. It's just I haven't had the experience of indigeneity, and I wouldn't claim that. It would make no sense for me to claim that. So I want to explain a little bit about why I'm not Indigenous or not Indigenous to other places in ways that, for example, formerly enslaved Africans oftentimes will identify as Indigenous from Africa and no longer on their land. So that it seems like we're kind of doing a special issue here on Indigenous questions about indigeneity, which is totally fine. But yeah, it's a little complicated for us in that we are not Indigenous. So to start with that, it reminds me of the Zapatista, the famous Zapatista slogan about one world in which many worlds are possible. So if I were to take a stab at trying to synthesize all the things that I've learned from Indigenous people and reading Indigenous literature, a lot of it can probably come down to this point of simple, basic human dignity that doesn't privilege the world of settler colonialism over and above all the other possible worlds. And that genealogy, for those of you who are interested in this particular way of understanding the world, comes out of Latin America and Latin American theory in what we call broadly the decolonial way of approaching questions like this, one world in which many worlds are possible. And it speaks to some of what I said in my earlier answer about the way in which the violence of universal perspective is represented most, I think, strongly in the world today through Eurocentricity and through the assumption of the rational human agent that is European and white and straight and all that other stuff. We can do a whole episode on that. But basically creating the conditions for other kinds of conceptions of the world to thrive, I think, is what's necessary there. And Leanne Simpson, who Alex mentioned earlier, is just especially brilliant in articulating this. She has a podcast, it's like a lecture that she did called The Brilliance of Beaver. I think it's on our reading list. If not, we'll add it. Absolutely phenomenal. In that one, she says that what settlers understood to just be wastelands and nature was the actual labor that her Anishinaabe ancestors got up every day and created an Anishinaabe world. which the white European settler capitalist world is fully incapable of seeing. And the episodicness of this, right? Like looking at the flashpoints that you see on the news is understandable when you're just watching the news, but it's all the stuff in between. Like Indigenous people have never stopped resisting from the moment of discovering Europeans off the coast of the Western Hemisphere in 1492. It has been uninterrupted resistance against incredible odds. And people have been doing lots of incredible work that will never, ever be in the news, and that work of resuscitating what the violence of universal culture sought to destroy is a very radical and profound form of healing and articulation of resistance in and of itself. So, yeah. I will leave it there. Back to you, Alex.
Awesome. Okay, continuing along, and we do have a bit of a theme going here, though I promise we're going to branch out into other topics soon. I think I'm going to collapse these two together, even though they're not really the same question at all, but they're the next two that have to do with Indigenous peoples, and we'll take them as one. So the first says, or to take them together, do you think there's value in considering the word reconciliation in light of truth and reconciliation? To nitpick the concept, where was the conciliation to begin with? Is reconciliation really happening? And the second question is about history, comparison, and Indigenous versus settler societies. So I'm going to read a bit of it and try and capture the spirit of it. Is there possibly a sort of rose-colored glasses effect applied to the past when looking at Indigenous history and ways of life, especially in comparison with settler culture that so brashly overtook and perpetrated genocide as it does to this day? I actually think that's a pretty awesome encapsulation of the rest of the question. It goes on sorry to cut short your narrative, just, in the interest of time. So is there a rose-colored glasses? In other words, do we kind of run the risk of celebrating the difference of Indigenous societies, of seeing them as closer to nature, more egalitarian, less violent, more all these kinds of, the whole noble savage thing, versus the violence, the authority, the certainty, the coloniality, the imperialism of European societies that were the tip of the spear in terms of the settler colonial project in this part of the world anyway. So I think, in some ways it's a nice two-part question, thinking about reconciliation. Let's deal with the second question first about romanticism. And I have to say, I have a huge problem with romanticism, both because I'm really very passionate about my position as a historical materialist. And I think the conditions of people's lives matter. But also as an anthropologist, I would say that, we don't come to a better understanding of people by creating archetypes, caricatures, or dreams out of them, right? So we all know that our own lives are, irrefutably complex, complicated, contradictory, hypocritical at times, beautiful, all this kind of stuff. But, we can imagine the lives of celebrities, let's say, being simple, being wonderful, being blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. Further away you are from something, the more it's easy to project what you want onto it. And I think to some extent that obviously happens, right? The violence of the settler colonial project has erased a lot of the historical, artifacts, documents that we might have recovered, right, from that might still be in existence if the genocidal intent of settler colonialism hadn't been so fully realized. So those, the histories, the things that we could actually talk about, the uninterrupted transmission of knowledge between generations, for example, that the settler colonial project worked so hard to destroy, to interrupt, has created a real problem for us if you just want to talk about the evidence and comparing some of that, right? So where can we even find the historical memory when the societies that ended up occupying the territory and dominating those populations have been the ones to claim the right to tell the story to begin with? I think that's just an empirical problem. So, but the best work on this, I think, and for me, the best place to go to is to simply treat people like people. So of course we acknowledge that everybody is capable of violence. Everybody is capable of exploitation. Everybody is capable of oppression and great depravity, just like everybody is capable of great beauty, altruism, care and concern for themselves, for others forms of life. And I think, like, for me, I'm not interested in romanticizing indigenous cultures or peoples. It does them no favors. It's not like in their interest to be seen as caricatures, right? Nobody wants to be seen that way. That said, like, there's also no point in reducing those differences to superficial ones, right? To saying, oh, well, if they just developed in different parts of the world. The fact is that part of that narrative, part of that universalizing logic that AJ was talking about earlier really relies on this subtext of, well, the problem was that Europeans were just further ahead in the game. They came here and indigenous peoples just weren't up to the task of, like, living through that encounter, right? And yes, of course, there were excesses, but they just faded away in light of this great tidal wave of European settlerism, right? And I mean, that misses just so much. We can't get into what it misses like right now, like just like microbes alone, right? We just come through a pandemic. Europeans can't take credit for having bred some of the most dangerous urban-based diseases at the time that decimated them before it decimated other people elsewhere. And that was really the tip of the genocidal spear in a lot of ways. But aside from that, I think, we have a lot to learn by taking a humane, nuanced, and complicated look at history and understanding the fact that, there were indigenous nations that were imperialists, like the Aztec, like the Inca, for example. There were nations that were warlike. Many of the, the Plains nations were engaged in warfare with each other, took captives, took slaves. Like there's evidence of cannibalism, of scarcity, like among every human population that's ever existed. So I would say, like, before passing it over to AJ, no, don't treat them like noble savages, don't romanticize, but also don't fall into the way easier trap, way more available trap of seeing them as somehow like primitive holdovers, as victims of settler colonialism who were doomed in light of the modern world. See them instead as peoples who have the right, just like you do, to chart their own course in this world, to live alongside others by directing their own societies, their own cultures, their own communities, by having a stake in that world, by having a right to see it differently. And like, I don't know, I think that that's a wonderful place to begin. Debating like who has the right. I mean, the Romans ran over all kinds of other Europeans for like 1,000 years, right? Like, would we simply say that all those other cultures should have faded away and died because the Romans were better technologically? I mean, these arguments don't get us anywhere, I think, especially in terms of where we're at now. Over to you, AJ.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a tendency to overly valorize what's called in the literature like the fatal impact thesis, right? The idea that that's what Alex was kind of getting at there about the inevitability of technology. And I think that's implied in the longer form of this question, that talks about, many things. It's a very long question, but just, to build on what was said here already, it's not Indigenous people, generally speaking, who have those rose-colored glasses. So the formulation of the question oftentimes will serve a settler interest, even if it's a subconscious one. And then the other thing I wanted to say about it is that it's not even about I think the question of indigeneity, the question about decolonization, has never been about whether or not something else is better or not better than the reality in which we live. We're materialists. We live in one world, and history matters in terms of how history has made this particular world. And what that means is that the particular rhythms, dynamics, and decisions that have gone into making this world have necessarily stopped other worlds from thriving in ways that it might choose itself. that people might direct themselves to live in. And that's the violence that we keep coming back to in this episode, is a violence of a single vision, a single verse, a universe, one verse, in which the only logic is the logic of, capitalist accumulation, for example, commodification of life, whether it's, enslaved Indigenous Africans, treated as thingified and treated as commodities to be traded for the purpose of, enriching lands that were stolen from Indigenous people across the Western Hemisphere, and how other Asians have later been integrated into that process. So it's about, it's not about saying that, in Indigenous cultures broadly conceived were more peaceful, but there's nothing wrong inherently, and this may be controversial, there's nothing wrong with war. It's kind of an unfortunate thing when things have to go to war, but the way in which war is conducted has oftentimes been organized around different principles anyway, right? So when we think about the horrors of war, what we're really thinking about are the European engineered wars, right? The so-called world wars, where folks from the rest of the world were had this war thrusted on them, oftentimes made into foot soldiers that were never even adequately acknowledged, let alone accommodated. In these grotesque wars of technological supremacy and destruction. That's not, generally speaking, how small-scale wars and conflicts have occurred in what we might broadly call the quote-unquote indigenous worlds all over the place. There are different ethics to war. There are different ethics to conflict and resolution, to get back to the point about conciliation and reconciliation. I don't think that, I don't know. I feel like to some extent, it doesn't matter what we think about whether or not we're in a position of conciliation or reconciliation. It's really about whether or not Indigenous people feel that they're being reconciled with. And in my sense, speaking from only the settler perspective, I don't think that we are in a position, because we're not yet at the truth yet, right? We haven't gotten to the point where settlers en masse, and I would include Asian settlers and, non-white settlers in that too, have not come to terms with the violence of universality that we're talking about here. And how, whether or not when I talk about Asians like myself here, just because we might have been able to thrive in certain forms of settler colonialism, right? Like, I'm a professor, I'm stable, I'm a middle class, like all these other things. The fact that I was able to navigate that, in my opinion, does not remove me from the violence of settler colonization, in part because, my institution is complicit in these forms of ongoing colonization. And probably yours are too, whoever asked this question, right? That's to some extent the condition in which we are in, but it doesn't limit our capacity for, acting differently. And a big part of that is, I think, just fundamentally, like, my core answer to these questions is just, it's not about would an Indigenous-led future be better or worse. It's about the one world in which many worlds are possible to live out as people see fit, in congruence with the laws and traditions that have developed alongside the land since time immemorial. Alex?
Yeah, super well said, for sure. All right, hopping right along to the next question. Okay. Pardon me. In light of you both pointing out that a term like BIPOC reflects a white-centered reality, is there a way to relieve that? So yeah, this is a recurring theme on this show a little bit. We've talked about BIPOC a lot. I don't love this term for a lot of different reasons, but yeah, I think you're right in a lot of ways. I think it's homogenizing in terms of Black, Indigenous, people of color. It's a bit of a it can be, again, it's not necessarily a huge axe that I have to grind with this, but it's simply recognition that it reflects a huge diversity of peoples and their experiences, and it really just exists to say not white, right? Everybody who's not white. So I would rather talk about non-white people, right? That's just, for me, I don't know how you create a term in a white supremacist context that doesn't reference white supremacy really. So yeah, if I talk about immigrants or, I mean, obviously that just speaks to a certain portion of the population. If I talk about minorities, I find that even more problematic, to be honest. Like, here if we want to really drill down into the notion of minority, we were talking about like statistical, calculations of demographics. That's inaccurate unless we want to be really specific. So again, what are we talking about? We're talking about the elephant in the room. When we're talking about BIPOC, we're really talking about white supremacy, about like the white norm that gets to sort of be that invisible yardstick against which all of social reality is measured. And I just I don't know, like we could worry about the terminology. Obviously, I would never want to use terms that racialized people find insulting, but I think it's really difficult to come up with a term that is dignified under conditions that are incredibly undignified. I think like it's way less important for us to think about the terminology than it is to think about what does this point to, right? How can I like legitimately group, let's say a Black person in North Preston here in Nova Scotia, who's like, whose family has been here for hundreds of years, with a recent Black migrant from South Africa, with like a Chinese person who's second generation, with a, you know what I mean? Like we can continue to spin this out, right? We're talking about totally different experiences, gender, class, age, ability, so many other categories affecting our experiences. So I would just say, the terms that we use should always be useful to the purpose we're putting. If you're talking usefully about like a part of society that is kind of like inhabited or concerned with issues that are relating to that group of people, there's nothing wrong with using BIPOC. I'm certainly not telling you not to. I'm simply pointing out why I find it like kind of a bit of a useless and empty term. But that doesn't mean that you have to find it the same way. AJ?
Yeah, I mean, the first time I ever heard the word BIPOC, I heard it from my students. I'd never heard it before. I certainly never thought to identify that way. To be fair, I also never heard the word brown until, I was 19 and moved to the West Coast for the first time, because I grew up in Halifax and didn't really know very many brown people. So like the whole understanding when I was growing up in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia was, you were Black or you were white. There was nobody talked about Indigenous people. People oftentimes didn't even know that there was more than this Black and white binary. So the terminology, what I'm getting at is the terminology is constantly evolving to speak to the needs in the moment. So when I heard my students saying BIPOC, I thought, yeah, I can get behind that. I'm not too worried about it. I think what it is a thin but strong attempt at forging a sense of solidarity in terms of the fact that for many people, although we have all these different things that are not in common at all, we share a common experience under structural white supremacy, which is different from the individual white supremacy, the actions of an individual Nazi, so to speak. But as products, the way that whiteness has impacted communities all over the world, including white communities, and ordered the world in a very particular modernist capitalist sense, makes it such that we can at times identify through the common denominator of experiences under structural white supremacy in order to forge forms of temporary and significant solidarity. And I think that's where BIPOC emerges. It's not as precise, obviously. Personally, I use racialized all the time. I like racialized because it implies that something was done to someone else, right? You were racialized. So I wasn't born with any, like I said, I was 19 before I even heard the word brown before. So in terms of, thinking about race, people are always more precise than any category can capture. But I do think, I think that there's value in understanding how whiteness does affect everybody. And thus the idea that we're centering whiteness when we say BIPOC, to me, that's not really a problem, because whiteness is at the center of modernity, colonial modernity. So if we are not centering whiteness, to me, that's a problem. And that's why in my work on this subject in particular, I like to center whiteness, to name whiteness, as we do this safe space for white questions. I've been involved in the past with a white fragility clinic. In talking about whiteness, it kind of like in a post-structural way, just kind of ruptures the sense of what's normal, because then white people have to start thinking about themselves in racial terms. Which is something that the rest of us have always had to do. But white people, by definition of being white in a white supremacist society, have not had to think about themselves in racial terms. So I think there's value. I don't think there's you don't need to split hairs over it, in my opinion. And I've certainly heard from many of my colleagues of various backgrounds, a huge variety of opinions about it. So I think it's contextual. Alex?
Yeah, great answer for sure. All right, moving right along. We have about 10 minutes left, I think. So we are going to see if we can get through a couple more questions. Prabhjot Singh Katri was brutally murdered September 2021 in Truro, Nova Scotia. There has been little to no press coverage since the arrests. I seem to recall the media initially jumping to the conclusion of white supremacy / hate crime. Jagmeet Singh immediately tweeted, quote, "This murder is a reminder that racism kills," end quote. Is the life of Katri somehow less significant / worthy of press coverage since the perpetrators happen to be Indigenous? So a provocative and loaded question here, I think. I would say, to your question, my answer is a bit in your framing, right? Why would you assume that the life of this person is being devalued because we haven't seen follow-up coverage? Unfortunately, the vast majority of murders that occur in Canada, we don't get subsequent coverage for. Where I'm going to take your point, and I think you're right, is I remember when that murder happened. I remember hearing about Katri being killed, and I remember worrying that it was, a white supremacist murder, that it was targeted and intentional. And thankfully, I didn't jump onto social media and tweet that or whatever at the time. I wanted to see how that played out. Other people did, like Jagmeet Singh, for example, and other politicians. In part not because there's a conspiracy against white people, okay? Because we're in a moment where those flames have been fanned incredibly vigorously, right? We're seeing what's going on all over the world. It's impossible to even throw a dart at a map and not find a place where we have this kind of surging racialized violence in play, not because race is something deeply woven into us and we are all working out our animosities with each other, but because it's a critical identity and socially constructed identity category that's being used to rule us by the ruling class and to split us up against each other and to take our shit and make us fight each other all the time. That's a brutally simplistic answer, and it's not really my true answer, but I'm going to give you for real, if geneticists agree, right, that race is a bogus category that doesn't exist, your DNA does not speak to race, it's a social category, then how could we imagine it being the source of real animosity between people, right? So when this international student, I believe, was killed in Truro, it certainly seemed like it could have been a targeted killing, right? He's a guy, he's wearing a turban, middle of the night in a fairly white part of the country. As it turns out, it wasn't. It was an Indigenous person, and that makes his death no less of a tragedy and his killing no less of a crime, no less of a murder, for sure. But I would suggest that I think this is very much par for the course. And in fact, when we see these sorts of things happen, it's unfortunately been borne out over the last little while that these kinds of attacks are often motivated by that kind of animosity, right? By racial hatred, might be a hate crime. In this case, lots of people jumped on that without assumption and were wrong about it. And that was borne out and indeed was reported that way in the news. So I don't think it's an indication that Katri's life was somehow less significant because his killers were Indigenous. Nor do I think it's an example of how Indigenous people are treated lightly by the criminal justice system. And if you need evidence of that, you just need to look at the number of Indigenous people in prison in Canada and the over-policing of Indigenous communities. But I do think it has everything to do with violence that is conditioned by this society in which we live, where we are encouraged to, to exert force against people that we feel we can reach, right? And so you want to talk about things like domestic homicide. You want to talk about things like family violence. You want to talk about things like intra-community violence, right? In part, these things happen because people who are up against the cutting edges of violence constantly in society look for ways to eke out existence in the world, but also just to, vent the incredible feelings of frustration and dismay. And I'm not letting any of that off the hook, right? But like that, alcoholism, drug abuse, other forms of street violence, harassment, and crime, all these kinds of things, they characterize many marginalized communities. Why? Because those communities are marginalized to begin with. So I take your point about jumping to conclusions, but I think it's important to keep in mind here that the reality was the investigation occurred, the killers were found, and that there wasn't a motivation here to follow up on. So what was the story we were supposed to get? Unless you have information that we don't have. Over to you, AJ.
Yeah, I guess the only thing I would add to it, I remember when this killing happened, and I remember, the media context prior to the killing as well, which included lots of story. And this isn't to try and let the media off the hook. I feel like there's a whole other way we can interpret this question about what's Canadian media doing in terms of follow-up coverage around different instances of racialized violence, and killing. But there were lots of stories about racist incidents faced by, Indian Uber drivers and Indian cab drivers, especially up in Sydney, which is just further north. And for those of you who are watching this broadcast but aren't necessarily from Mi'kma'ki, Nova Scotia, I think it's important to note that there's been a pretty significant demographic shift in the province since about 2018 or so. And we've seen lots more South Asians coming, which has been absolutely lovely for a variety of reasons. But at the same time, it has also, especially in certain parts of the province, has been met with forms of, street level racial violence. So I feel like in the moment of that time, for folks to jump to the conclusion, and Jagmeet Singh was quoted as saying, this is a reminder that racism kills. To my mind, that statement stands. This is a reminder that racism kills. There were countless instances of racialized violence against Indians and Asians anyway. Since 2020, racist incidents against Asian people has increased over 700% on preceding years. These are really significant numbers of anti-Asian hate in a country that has in many ways articulated its position and view as a society as being anti-Asian, from 100 years ago onwards. So I don't think that it is in error to say that racism kills. In this instance, it happened to be that it was not a white person who did the killing, but whiteness, especially when we talk about structural white supremacy, is present even in the absence of white people. Whiteness isn't about a white person. Whiteness is a form of structural power, the kind of ways in which some bodies are valued and others are not. I don't know the details. Alex seems to have a better handle on actually what happened here, so I'll defer to his analysis there. But the only point I wanted to add is that, and I think it's really important, is that the society that devalues brown or Black or Indigenous lives is more to blame than the individual person who may or may not have done that violence. And this isn't me trying to defend the Indigenous people who killed this guy. I'm largely abolitionist in general. I don't think that prisons or that whole carceral system actually accomplishes any social good whatsoever. So there's that, like there's this whole other argument about how we actually deal with these problems, for which I would highly suggest folks pick up abolitionist intimacies, and what's the other
Insurgent
one?
Love.
Yes, Insurgent Love by L. Jones and Ardith Wynot, respectively. Yeah, back to you, Alex.
Yeah, awesome points. Yeah, I just wanted to add to what AJ was saying there really quickly and say we should also remember that there's another layer here. AJ's reminder that this is not like, this doesn't disprove racism killing, right? This could very well be an example of that. Just in a, like just because it's not a hate crime doesn't mean it's not racism, right? That's the other point that came to my mind when you were talking, AJ. It's because like people mistake that. They're like, oh, the cops didn't charge this is a hate crime. That means there was no motivation. You need to remember that hate crime legislation, it's an incredibly difficult bar to meet in Canada and elsewhere. That meeting the legal test for a hate crime means you can prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the crime was motivated essentially by like a structured and ideological hatred of that group of people, and that it was carried out as a result of that ideology and that organizing. So like you basically have to be adorned in Nazi regalia, right? Like goose stepping down the street and going after Jews to be like, like in that mode, or you have to be wearing a Klan hood and chasing Black people. These sorts of things, like it is a very difficult test. It doesn't mean that white supremacy wasn't involved. And I think that's such a great point, right? Just like when a man abuses his female partner, it doesn't, like, just because he doesn't personally express rigorously formulated misogynist views doesn't mean that violence isn't a product of a larger misogynistic context. That like when he's upset, when he's overstressed, when he's exhausted at work, when his own humanity is degraded, he sees that woman's body as his outlet, as his punching bag, as his way to redeem or just to vent. Like that whole, you're like, oh, but I wasn't thinking, I never meant to engage in misogynistic violence. The outcome is still the same, right? You're still motivated by those structures. And I think AJ put such a good point on that. I just wanted to emphasize that. Folks, that has actually brought us right to the end today, and aware of our promise to you and cognizant of our limitations and the wonderful support provided by our great comrades at Fernwood Publishing. We're going to have to call it right now. We've got lots of questions left over from this month, and we have questions left over from before. So you're going to have to join us in April again, where we're going to return to this and welcome your new questions. Before I send it back to AJ to wrap it up, I just want to say thanks again for joining us, as always, in Safe Space for White Questions. It's our very great pleasure to be here with you and talking about such serious issues, and sometimes sharing some jokes and humor and, like puzzling out some difficult problems too. Thanks for all the questions. It was a blast to go through them with you. Thank you for your honesty and your sincerity. And we will see you next month. Don't forget, if you haven't already, to pick up a copy of Frequently Asked White Questions and check out what all the buzz is about. Over to you, AJ.
I mean, I think Alex pretty much said it. We weren't as funny this time around as we normally try to be, but I think that's a reflection of the heaviness of the question. So yeah, just to reiterate, thank you for your great questions. Sorry we couldn't answer all of them. Maybe we'll get a little creative over the summer about how we can do some blast answers to some of the questions. It's a lovely problem to have, that we're just kind of getting overrun by questions. Please keep them coming. We will eventually get to all of them. So see you next month, and yeah, be well.